All right. So the nonprofit National Popular Vote is very happy to be hosting today's conversation on how a nationwide campaign for the presidency would be run. National Popular Vote was founded in 2005, and we advocate for the National Popular Vote Bill, which is a state-based plan that works to reform the Electoral College. When in effect, this bill will guarantee the presidency to the winner of the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC, making every vote equal in presidential elections for the very first time. So far, this bill has been enacted by 16 jurisdictions with a total of 195 electoral votes. I'll be hosting today's conversation. I'm Eileen Reavey, and I serve as the National Grassroots Director for National Popular Vote. Today's guest is Paul Maslin of FM3 Research. Paul has been one of the leading public opinion analysts and campaign strategists for more than 3 decades. Paul's recent noteworthy work includes polling and providing strategy for Doug Jones in the 2017 Alabama special election for US Senate, and working as the lead strategist on 2 of the toughest and most prominent Democratic Senate victories in recent years. Paul has worked on dozens of ballot measure campaigns, ranging from drug policy reform and Indian gaming to parks and water bonds and school funding, stadium construction to community college expansion. Paul attended Harvard University, receiving his BA in government in 1978, and began his career working on the successful 1976 campaign of Jimmy Carter. Since then, he has polled for 7 presidential candidates. Thank you so much for joining us today, Paul.
Thank you, Eileen.
And thank you to everyone for listening in. For those of you that are watching via Zoom, you are able to submit questions using the Q&A feature. So you'll be able to submit them by typing them in there. Make sure to send all of your questions there as opposed to through the chat. We've reserved the last portion of this webinar for questions from the audience. You can submit them at any time, but we'll go ahead and answer them at the end. We do have a large number of attendees, so if we don't get to your question, it's just a matter of capacity. This webinar is being shared live on our Facebook at National Popular Vote, and will be available afterwards, both on our Facebook page and on National Popular Vote's YouTube channel. So with that, I want to go ahead and get started. So Paul, first of all, I think some people just think of pollsters and strategists as mathematicians. They're crunching numbers and spitting out an answer and saying, here, go here, candidate. And I'm hoping you can tell us in your own words what you really do and the strategic component that's involved in your work.
Yeah, and they probably also added that, and they're wrong too in these last couple of elections. Although those have been public polls, they haven't all been wrong. I think the biggest thing, what I would say, Eileen, is that every campaign has some kind of overall strategic, and the best ones have a very good strategy and a good plan, but they've got some kind of strategic mechanism, and then they have to make a series of tactical decisions, many of them involving how to spend money, how to manage their resources, how to communicate with voters. And what pollsters do is hopefully help develop that overall grand strategy through the work that we do in trying to understand, sometimes modeling a campaign, what will happen if X happens or Y happens or Z gets into a race or key issues rise. And then obviously in the crunch time of a campaign, crunch time these days is getting longer and longer, but those last few months or several weeks where you have intense communication, hopefully we are tracking what's happening in a given state or national campaign or congressional district to make sure that the money is being spent in the right way and aimed at the right voters with the right messages. It's part of an overall campaign that hopefully has a lot of different components to it. We're not the only ones, but we help guide a lot of those decisions that campaigns make.
Excellent, thank you. And so you have polled for 7 presidential candidates. And so before we talk about how candidates will campaign under a national popular vote, I want to talk about how they campaign now and how they make their decisions currently under the current electoral college system.
Yeah, and I think, I'm one of those junkies that early on, I loved the electoral college. The idea that there was a numerical system and you had to get to 270, and every 10 years, the states change a little bit in terms of their impact. And was there a blue wall? Was there a red wall? All that stuff. I think we've all come to see the huge fault of the system, and one of the primary faults of this system, not the only one certainly, is the fact that we've now had campaigns that are increasingly compressed and essentially are aimed at sometimes as few as 6 or 8 states, generally no more than 10 or 12 states that are receiving intense attention. Of course, there's a national campaign that goes on no matter what. When you're getting national news and cable news, and you're getting overall social media, and a variety of things are happening in the blog or podcast world or YouTube these days. But the real directed campaign, where most of the money is aimed at, is really only going on in about 10 or 12 states these days. There's 35, 40 states that are being either totally ignored or almost completely ignored. They don't get television advertising. They don't get a voter contact campaign. They don't get social media or a digital campaign. They don't get remember candidate visits pre-pandemic? We actually had candidates who went to places. Trump did a little bit at the end. They don't get candidate visits. They don't get surrogate visits. They don't get interviews on their local news stations. All the things that happen in those specific states, in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, where I live, or Florida or Georgia, don't happen in about 75 to 80% of the states in this country. And increasingly, the voters in those states have begun to think, I don't matter, or it's wrapped up in my state because either the Democrat's going to win or the Republican's going to win. Who cares? And I think that has a deleterious effect on our overall democracy and on people's view of the election. And so we have this aberrant system that's bizarre when you think about it. Why are we spending all of this time, effort, and money aimed at just this small? Everybody complains about Iowa and New Hampshire and their role in the primary process, and that's a separate debate. But we do the same thing in November as well, and clearly that's a system that needs change.
Yeah, and something you touched on was the impact that this has on voters, and that we see lower voter turnout rates in the non-battleground states, right? And we see more engagement, unsurprisingly, in the states where they're actually campaigning to those individuals.
Absolutely right, and it at a time when, for better or often for worse, there are serious questions being raised now about our democratic system, our institutions, about whether elections are fair or were determined correctly, or whether the counter reaction to that. I mean, we've gone through a really difficult time period this last year, and with more trouble ahead. This just adds, I think, to some of the frustration and displacement that people feel about this electoral system. That somehow, if I'm living in a state where nobody even bothers to come and ask for my vote, it's got to cheapen and weaken, my relationship with democracy and with ultimately the presidency and our national leadership. It's got to have a wearing effect over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I was going to ask you about, because sometimes when we're talking about this, and I tell people, in the 2012 presidential election, and 16 and 20, the entire campaign, or 96% of campaign events or more, happened in just a dozen states. And sometimes people have a hard time seeing the connection of, well, why do I care where they're campaigning, and the bigger picture? But it's exactly what you're talking about. It's they're listening to those ideas and they're engaging those voters, and it makes people just less informed, and also maybe that their opinion doesn't really get heard, and things that are important to people all around the country don't get prioritized because, well, maybe fracking in Pennsylvania was more important.
Yeah, and I mean, I joked earlier that when Iowa became such a big deal in the caucuses and really for both parties in the whole nominating process, everybody had a pro-ethanol view. I mean, there was no one was going to go on the other side of that issue because it matters to people who grow corn in Iowa, and whether that's right or not, I don't think it's healthy. This one of the proudest things about America is how diverse we are, how vast this country is, how many different kinds of people are living in this country, not only in terms of race and ethnicity and religion and type of community, et cetera. We shouldn't have. And when we get to this, of course, I'll anticipate where we're going, Eileen. One of the knocks that some people give, and I'm gonna puncture that balloon real quickly, is that, oh, under NPV, it would only be just the few big markets that everybody would appeal to, and only the big cities and the big areas would be part of the campaign. And I think that's simply fundamentally not true. We would have a much broader and more diverse and much fairer way for voters to be engaged in the system than the one we have now.
Yeah, and let's get into that because I think a lot of that, when people think, oh, they're just going to go to LA and New York, or okay, maybe they'll go to the 10 biggest cities or the 5 biggest states, but people don't have a real good grasp of those numbers, right? Or where our population actually lives. Or that, using the 2010 census numbers, because we haven't quite gotten the city level ones from the 2020 census, 19% of America lives in our 100 largest cities. 19% of America lives in rural America, and
Right.
everyone else is in between, right? So can you talk about how those candidates are going to campaign once we
Yeah.
have a national popular vote?
And I'll do it in 2 quick ways. One is that, remember, I've done statewide campaigns for governor or senate, my entire career, and campaigns that are well funded, and believe me, a presidential campaign will be well funded. We're talking about, for each side, just the presidential campaign, not even counting the independent expenditures, there will be hundreds of millions of dollars spent in communicating to voters in every election in the foreseeable future. We're getting close to the point where the two campaigns combined now raise $1 billion overall, and then the independent expenditures gets to go on top of that. So you're probably talking ultimately about over $1 billion worth of communication just on the presidential campaign. We're up to $5 or $6 billion now being spent in overall in terms of all elections, but we're over $1 billion. So they're going to be well funded. Campaigns that are well funded in a big state like California or Texas or New York or Florida, any of them, believe me, they communicate in almost every single market in that state. They don't just, oh, we're just going to go LA and San Francisco. No, you're not. You're going to campaign in Sacramento. You're going to advertise in San Diego. You're going to advertise in Fresno. You're going to advertise in Waco and El Paso as much as Dallas or Houston. I mean, there will be major campaigns that are run that are not going to exclude places, because guess what? There are voters even in the small markets. And if you're thinking about a potentially close election, you have to worry about the small markets. So
every vote would be equal. Every vote would matter, no matter where it was cast in the country. What I like to say to folks, when they worry, oh, I live in a small state, no one's ever going to come here. Well, let's look at Wyoming, a population of 550,000. That population is greater than the margin of victory of the popular vote in the 2000 election. So entire states being ignored because of their geographic boundary, that's what happens now. And that's not what's going to happen under a national popular vote.
Or entire partisan voting groups. Obviously, if you're in a overwhelmingly red state right now and you're a Democrat, nobody ever communicates with you because you're just assumed that your vote doesn't matter because it's going to go to the Republicans, and vice versa. If you're in a heavy Democratic state and you're a Republican, you're going to be ignored. No one's ever going to communicate to you because, again, unless there's a big Senate race going on there, a congressional district, and that sometimes happens, but not always. But in terms of the presidential election, you're going to be ignored. Under this system, not all of them, but certainly the vast majority of those voters come into play.
Yeah. I live in a particularly blue state in Oregon, and something Oregon has that not all states have is a voter pamphlet guide that gets mailed to you. It's from the Secretary of State. The campaigns submit, information that they want to go out to all candidates. So it's not a paid thing. It's just a service provided by the state, essentially. One of the presidential candidates had a spelling error in the first sentence of their description of their campaign bio. I can't imagine that would have happened if we had been Pennsylvania or Florida, which saw 34% of all campaign visits in 2020. But in Oregon, it was the Republican campaign. They said, we're not going to win those electoral votes anyway. We don't even need to proofread it, right? And that's just a small example of the lack of attention that happens in those states to those opposing parties.
And I'll add one other thing, and I don't want to get too Pollyannish here because we have obviously a deeply divided country, and it's not going to be healed overnight. And there are all kinds of systemic and other problems that are leading to this. But I will say this. I think that certainly a contributor to our current division is the minute that whoever it was, and I don't know if it was NBC originally but whoever started going with red and blue, and all of a sudden everything became red and blue and red and blue and red and blue. I think that has added to the sense of disconnect and us versus them and some of the division that occurs. I can't help but believe if we had a true national campaign where everybody got involved and everybody was part of the process, or nearly everybody, and the campaigns were directing their efforts all over the country and all parts of the country, that wouldn't at least in some small way help tone down some of the rhetoric and some of the vitriol that we've seen in recent years. And again, I'm not trying to overstate this because there are all kinds of other problems that are afoot, but it couldn't hurt.
I think it's a factor. I mean, it's the most prominent race. There are some people who will turn out to vote just for that one election, and actually having their vote matter in it, I think that would help and make people more engaged in our civics and have a better understanding of it, increase voter turnout. I mean, if you look at Gen Z, so most of Gen Z was able to vote in the presidential election for the first time in 2020. It was the first time anyone in their generation was able to vote for it. And 50% of Generation Z has spent, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. All of Generation Z has spent at least 50% of their life with a president who was not originally elected by national popular vote. That's got to have an impact on our youngest voters when they feel so disconnected from the process. How do we expect them to be able to go on and be engaged in other races when they really feel like their vote doesn't matter? Because in most states, it doesn't.
And to get more current, and I don't want to, I mean, obviously I'm a partisan here, but let me just take off my partisan hat and simply state the following. We now have a system where one side either thinks more people voted for my candidate and he or she somehow didn't get elected, and they know for a fact that's true, and that's an aberration and has led to great cynicism and real frustration. And you have another side that has come to believe, again, I'm not debating the accuracy of this belief, just simply acknowledging it, that any number of states executed an election in this last year because of COVID or other factors that somehow was not honest, and that they feel like they've been cheated out of an election because of what may have happened in Arizona or Georgia or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or whatever. And again, people, no matter what system we have, of course, there will be complaints. There will be people who feel aggrieved, particularly if their candidate doesn't win. But certainly some of the biggest elements that are causing people to say, what in the heck is going on here? How can we have this kind of a result? How can we keep fighting over this for month and year after year? A lot of that would be reduced if we simply said, hey, guess what? Like every other election in this country, the candidate with the most votes wins. We all show up, we all vote, 100 and some million of us. And if somebody ends up with 1 million, 6 million, 10 million more votes than the other person, they're president. Surely some, not all, but some of this overheated temperature right now would cool off.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we had that in 2020 and all other things being the same in terms of how the vote turned out, we would have known on election night.
Everybody would have gone to bed at midnight and known who was the president was going to be.
Yeah, we wouldn't have had these ongoing days of conversations and wondering how Arizona and Georgia, Wisconsin were going to turn out. There wouldn't have been that. We would have I feel like that would have really helped a lot of people to just feel more confident in it, because they worry about, oh, well, this vote is coming in late. And understandably, the average person doesn't have to understand about, okay, mail-in ballots take certain time to process. In some states, they're allowed to start counting the ballots as they get mailed in right away, like in Florida. And in some states, they're not allowed to start counting until the polls close. The nuances of 51 different jurisdictions of election law shouldn't have to be understood by everyone in this country, right? But if we just said, hey, whoever gets the most votes wins, that seems like a much more clear outcome that people could get behind.
It's working in most of the rest of the world is all I can say. And we've now had, and again, try not to be partisan, but we've had 3 elections now in the last 20 years where either the candidate who did receive the most votes didn't end up being president, or in the last case, that it was still, despite a 7 million vote margin, still came down to a very narrow outcome fought over in a small number of states. And look at the residue. Look at what we're still fighting over. Look at what's still happening in the state legislative level and what may be happening again in 2024. This country is too extraordinary and too important for it to be threatened the way it is right now. And national popular vote is a real obvious, simple, and easy and good solution.
Excellent. So on that, I'm going to pivot back to something we were talking about a moment ago when you were talking about the media markets. So one question that comes up a lot when we talk about this is I often hear from people a concern that when we go to a national popular vote, the candidates are going to have to raise even more money. And some people don't like that. You know, they want publicly financed campaigns, or they want there to be more campaign contribution limits or no super PACs. But is that really true? Would they really have to raise more, or do candidates now raise every dollar that they can get? And it's just a matter of where it goes.
Yes, yes, yes. Of course, they'll raise more because that's unfortunately or fortunately, it keeps, I can't claim hypocrisy here. It keeps my business doing very well, thank you. But we have a monetary system that's out of control, and given where the free speech rulings have come down in terms of the court, that's not going to stop, and it's not going to be limited, obviously, to just with Citizens United and a variety of other decisions that have been made. It's not going to be limited to just the national campaigns themselves, but you're going to continue to have all kinds of money being raised by various independent groups and individuals. That's not going to change under whatever system we have. So I think the notion that the office still matters and people are going to compete for it. And if that's true, then like it or not, money follows. So it doesn't matter what system we have. There's still, like I said, the two campaigns almost got to $1 billion combined. That's just the campaigns. If you throw in the independent expenditure groups, it was well into several $billion that were spent on either the presidential campaign or its spinoffs in this last election, and that trend will continue.
Yeah. And when folks, think, oh, well, they're just going to campaign in the top 5 media markets, can you talk about the disparity of costs? I think some people we don't have a sense of that, right? That's not what people think about, but the cost of advertising in LA versus rural Oklahoma.
Yeah, it varies state by state and year to year. And this is not an absolute rule of thumb, but generally, you can find efficiencies below the level of LA, New York, Chicago, Houston, Boston, the Bay Area, et cetera, Washington, D.C. Some of the big markets are they're going to make money, and they're going to charge a premium. And someone's going to run these numbers. Believe me, it happens already, and it happens in statewide campaigns, but it'll certainly happen on a national level. And they may determine that somewhere in markets 52 to 83 that have a cumulative number of voters that's greater than the top 2 or 3 markets, that there's a greater efficiency of communication. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't still advertise in LA and Chicago and New York. Of course they will, but it may mean that they put disproportionately more money in some of the smaller or medium markets than they do in the large markets, because they simply get more bang for their buck. So all those judgments will be made. And I have to say, sometimes you get aberrant markets the other way. I mean, in Wisconsin, we had one of our smaller markets very famously in 2 or 3 of the last election cycles that just decided it's a political year, we're going to make money. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they doubled or tripled their rates, and people went, oh my God, can we even afford to communicate in that market? So you may get that as well. You'll get a variety of factors, but it will not be a given that somehow the best way to communicate will simply be going into the biggest markets. In fact, it could be the reverse.
Yeah. And this example that you just gave with Wisconsin, I mean, that's harmful or less advantageous for the presidential candidates. But what about whoever, the person was running for state house in that area? Yeah. And now, they already pay a higher rate because it's a swing state, and then it keeps going up.
And the other perfect example, in Wisconsin is one of these states. There are a number of states where there are adjoining big markets that have a footprint, it's usually not a big footprint. It may only be 5, 8, 9% of the vote, but because most of the advertising that you're buying is essentially aimed at all those people who live in that market in the other state. Minneapolis, St. Paul is the best example that I can give from in Wisconsin. A lot of states will just simply ignore that market because it just costs too much money. Well, guess what? In a national campaign with national dollars and national popular vote, that decision doesn't get made anymore. Of course, you communicate in Minneapolis, and part of the communication in Minneapolis goes to Wisconsin. Whereas in a Wisconsin race, unless you are really well funded, you're not even going to spend, or you might spend minimal dollars in that part of Wisconsin that's in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market. So all those things go out the window. It's a much fairer system.
Yeah. Something else to think about, and this is, I'd say particularly of interest to people who are a member of a party, whichever party it may be. We talk about under a national popular vote, you said that the candidates would be door knocking in at least 40 states, if not all 50, maybe having this actual campaign presence. Compared to now, doesn't a lot of that power get kind of shifted just to those 12 states, like the organizing power, the things you want to build your local infrastructure if you're a member of a party?
Absolutely. And it can have, and I think there's plenty of evidence of this on both sides. It can have sort of a snowballing effect, or whatever the reverse of snowball is, in terms of a negative effect on the party that is weaker in that state that never gets competed for. So they don't have much of a political organization. There is no effort to kind of mobilize or turn out their voters unless some big Senate race had happened or a governor's race had happened. And in some states, they haven't had a real competitive Senate race or governor's race in a long time. So there's atrophy, because they're being ignored every 4 years and 8 years and 12 years and 16 years, whereas state X, and sometimes state X might be right next door. State X is getting all the attention and all the effort and all the muscle of trying to build a political organization at from the ground up as well as from the top down. And because of that, of course, it's going to create a stronger, for both parties, it's going to create a stronger party mechanism and party apparatus and more volunteers and more activism in those states than in the states that have been ignored. You can't help, and I've seen vivid examples of that. Doug Jones was probably going to lose Alabama no matter what in 2020 with the electorate with Donald Trump on the ballot. But I guarantee you that one of the things that was hard for him is he won an election in Alabama in 2017, but there was no Democratic organization in Alabama because Alabama had not been competitive for so many years. So it was much harder, and he had to do so much more of it himself to try to motivate and activate and produce a winning coalition in 2020. And that's true in both parties in various states across the country. And that would be much less likely to happen under this system.
Yeah, I think that apathy just trickles down. I mean, you can go to the website of the Pennsylvania Democratic or Republican Party, and it's very nice. And compare that to some of the things that other states have, whether they're the minority or majority party. This is just a huge difference of resources. I mean, you've got tens of millions of dollars going into those state parties, as opposed to maybe we gave you $30,000 for the year.
And I'll say one more thing, having lived here in Wisconsin the last 20 years, and some of this is peculiar to us because of when Scott Walker got elected, a variety of things happened, but we've been living in this unbelievably intense environment now for 10 or 12 years. And other people might be envious that we're one of the states that always gets the attention. But believe me, I think there are people on both sides in this state that shake their heads sometime and just say, man, can't we calm this down? Here we go again? Here comes the circus again. And can we ever get out of this sort of death grip of all this intensity? Florida, I think, probably feels somewhat the same way. And it's not that, of course, Wisconsin or Florida or Arizona will still be part of a national campaign, but they won't be the be all and end all. They won't have everything thrown in here. And even the states that get the attention, I think, find that that maybe it's too disproportionate, too out of whack, too intense. Let's normalize things a little more.
Yeah, you've got 10 electoral votes. You're not going to suddenly fall off the map. You've got a good chunk of the, I say that because that correlates to your population size roughly. You've got a good amount of population. You're going to get an appropriate amount of attention rather than having what should be in 5 states all in Wisconsin.
We'll get 1.5% to 2% of the attention rather than about 20%. Yeah. I'll take it.
Yeah, and I'll take some of your extra attention. I'll carve off that in Oregon and Maryland and all these other states.
By the way, and just think about, okay, Democrats now think we may have a chance in Texas. We haven't previously, but essentially you've had California, Texas, and New York. I mean, there's, roughly about 20% of the population in those 3 states alone. And they are absolutely, almost totally, at least they have been in the past, ignored. I mean, just think of that. 2 of those states are Democratic states, one's Republican. They're ignored. That's by definition, that alone should cause us all to just sit back and say, what? How did it get this way?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense that you can move 10 miles over a state border and your vote can either be extremely of the utmost importance or, we already know how your state's going to go. We don't really care if you turn out to vote.
Right.
Can you speak to if there are any specifically like policy decisions or implications that you're aware of from any of the campaigns that you pulled on that were really influenced by battleground voters? I mean, I know you mentioned ethanol, but is it just a matter of those other voters aren't being heard? Or, is this something consistently we know that certain places are being prioritized?
I think that, if you sort of go back and look at the past few cycles, immigration is going to be an important issue no matter what. No one will deny that. But if you have states like Florida and Arizona or Nevada that are much closer to that particular issue for different reasons, then of course it's going to rise in importance. And again, if I talk about any of these issues, obviously there's a healthcare component to a campaign that's aimed in Florida that's going to be different. There are, because of the industrial base of Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, there are going to be certain kind of Midwest-oriented issues that will rise. And again, it's not that those issues will become unimportant if it's the entire country, because there are other states in this region that are also important and may share some of the same views. But you're certainly going to have a bigger priority put on certain issues if you're only running in 8 or 10 states than if you're running in 40. And it's much more likely that every issue that matters is going to get full attention rather than have some that get picked off for one reason or another. We are this incredibly vast country. We do have different viewpoints on issues on the economy, on trade, on religious involvement, on gun rights, on all kinds of things that vary depending on where we live. That's great. But let's just make sure that everybody's involved in the debate, and I think it's still healthier. One of them is being played out as we speak, and that is Cuba. There's no question, and I'm not trying to. Obviously, the protests in Cuba are for good reason, because of a lot of problems associated with the regime and what people have been left out of, and we can have different viewpoints about whether we should have normalized or whether there should be sanctions or whether there shouldn't be. That's a separate issue politically. But one thing is pretty obvious is that the whole issue of Cuba has taken a different tack because of Florida than it might if it was the entire country that was at stake here and not just one state with all those electoral votes.
Yeah, that's a great example. So one thing I want to make sure we touch on before we move to questions from the audience is, if there's just specific examples that you can kind of more point to of how we know that candidates campaign within states, because for governors or US senators or any of those statewide offices, I think that's a good parallel, right? It's a single winner district, and that's what the United States will be under a national popular vote. So on these campaigns you've worked on, do these same patterns hold?
Yeah, if I'm running a statewide campaign in a medium-sized state in this country and I've got resources, obviously some campaigns who don't have a whole lot of money end up making really tough decisions. They can't do everything. But in a national presidential campaign, everybody will have the money that they need. and certainly the money they need to do 90% of what they want to do. And in the campaigns that are like that, you can plot out well in advance. Okay, we're going to communicate in this way to these voters in these particular markets. We're going to have an entire plan. It's going to be done from A to B to C over a several week period or several month period in some states. Hell, in South Dakota, you know, when you get a big Senate race in South Dakota, they're already at sort of saturation level in March and April. I mean, the poor voters in those states, God almighty, they get so much advertising thrown at them. So that's being done. You're developing a voter contact program and a get out the vote program. You're figuring out how to deal with the local media. Print media doesn't matter as much, but it still matters because print media or blogs can sometimes set the tone and cause the television media to cover a race in a certain way. So you're still going to be aiming your efforts there, and you're having just what I'll simply say, what is kind of a normal campaign, where you sort of think about everything, and you think, and the parts that you let go for a while, they're still in the back of your mind. You know, nobody has Arkansas or Alabama or Rhode Island in the back of their mind in a presidential campaign. They're totally out of their mind. It's like, we don't care about that state because it's already done. But in a statewide campaign, you've got all parts of your state, all markets, all kinds of voters, and then you're thinking, okay, who are the voters I need to turn out and motivate? Who are they, and how are we going to do that? Who are the voters I still need to persuade? And without getting into all the whys and wherefores of some past campaigns, I think it's been fairly well proved now on both sides that you can't simply go to your base and only communicate with your base. There are voters in the middle in this country. Trump only communicated with his base. He may have done a very good job of it, but guess what? He lost the race in the middle. And those votes shifted over to Biden, and that was enough to carry Biden to victory. So you're worrying about, okay, are we persuading certain voters and how? Are we motivating certain voters and how? How do those two things mesh? Anyway, it's a real campaign, Eileen. And rather than this aberration that we see every 4 years for the most important office of all. And I'd love to see a real campaign being run for president again.
Absolutely. And so it sounds like we know that candidates are going to go all over because they do in statewide offices. And also an example that I want to share is that we know that they go all over within battleground states. You know, our organization, National Popular Vote, did a lot of research on this after the 2016 election and put out a memo analyzing where candidates went within battleground states in 2012 and 2016. And you take a state like Ohio, critical battleground state in both of those elections, and you break it up into three big parts: the three biggest metropolitan statistical areas, the 8 medium areas, kind of like the suburban areas, and then the 53 remaining counties, which have 22% of the population. If you look at the math of where candidates went, when the three biggest cities have 49% of the population, they saw 46.3% of the general election campaign events. Suburban areas, 29% of the population, 32.2%. Rural areas, 22% of the population had 21.5% of the general election campaign events. So people like yourself, the most expert, highly paid strategists in the country, are advising these campaigns and saying, yeah, the people are everywhere, so you've got to go everywhere. And so we can use data like that to look at it and say, yeah, we're not just guessing that it's going to be like this under a national popular vote, right? We're looking at this data and experience like yours with these past campaigns to really say, we know how this is going to be. Because campaigning is foreign to some people, but the people that are in it know that this is the direction it will go.
Yeah, absolutely right. And, and there'll be some growing pains because it'll be new and different, and one or two campaigns will make some mistakes and they'll realize later, oh, we should have done more of this or more of that. And that's normal. None of these campaigns are perfect. And by the way, and I saw a little question about social media recently that just popped up on the screen. Obviously the form of communication is changing before our very eyes, and that whole system is changing. And in one hand, there's always the allure of better able targeting. Okay, we now have social. We can't maybe communicate, because some people are cutting the cord. We can't communicate with people the old way. We got to do it in a new way. Well, trust me, there are analytics and metrics that are being devised to make sure that if you're going to go with a digital campaign, it's aimed at the right people in the right way, in the right time, in the right places. Again, and some of those platforms can be national, but to the extent that they are targeted and the money is being spent that way, I guarantee you, if this digital component of a national campaign will end up and under NPV will end up being aimed at 30, 35, 40 states rather than the 8 or 10 that we see today. It'll be the same pattern. It'll be the same way to communicate. And it may make the job a lot tougher in some ways, because people are going to have to get smarter about 40 states rather than just 10. But it won't alter the basic purpose, which is to try to reach as many voters as possible in as many platforms as possible with the best potential messages. That fundamental parts of campaigns will not change.
And moving on to some of these questions from the audience, what do you think presidential candidates will think about this change? The question is, wouldn't it be more expensive, which we kind of already talked about, but also exhausting for the candidates? What's your take on that?
Exhausting. They all work pretty hard anyway. There is a famous story about Nixon, that one of the reasons that Nixon did, in fact, not perform as well in the first debate against Kennedy, that famous first nationally televised debate, was that he was a little bit tired and sick. And one of the reasons he was sick is he'd vowed to campaign in all 50 states. Now, this is back in 1960, and he had to fly to Alaska and Hawaii, and he got stuck with that promise. Well, okay, air travel, they all campaign and they understand how to do that anyway. But campaigns, there's only so many hours in a day. Candidates, believe me, they will work the same 16-hour day that they always do. That's not going to change. Their campaigns will simply have to be smarter, and will have to apply themselves in more ways than they do now, but they're perfectly capable of doing it. And the travel component of it, won't be. I mean, obviously Biden was fortunate or not, depending on how you feel about it, to be able to stay in his basement for most of the campaign this year. But post-COVID, it's going to change, and we'll go back to the old system. But there will be nothing that much more taxing about a national campaign under these rules than there will be. I think in many ways it'll be liberating to the candidates, because they don't have to sweat those 10 states so much and worry that, oh my God, I've just made a mistake, or I've done something terrible, the Al Gore example is one of the best ones. Al Gore made a decision. His campaign made a decision to forego Florida for a last minute stop on the last weekend of the race. I think it might've been Sunday or Monday, but maybe Sunday. And I think he went to Michigan instead. Well, how many people have been haunted by that decision when the vote in Florida comes down to 300 votes, and all the craziness that followed, because they made one simple tactical decision, which, by the way, may have made sense. I'm not saying it was the wrong decision, but in hindsight, of course, is 2020. Well, all that goes out the window. Just campaign the way candidates always campaign in all these states.
Yeah, it's been 21 years since that, and I imagine there's still people who wake up thinking about that in the middle of the night.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So next question that I have here. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment to read through some of the ones we've got here. So with presidential candidates being forced to campaign in 40 plus states, would the change in that dynamic benefit one party or the other, do you think?
I think it's impossible to know. I think there are certain trends in our country right now, demographically, culturally, socially, that have led to a very small but clear trend in the Democrats' direction now nationally. Whether that holds, whether it expands, is a separate question. It is still, of course, blocked by the way the Senate is established, and the fact that redistricting is being done a certain way. And again, I don't want to get too political here, but clearly we still have certain parts of our democratic system that are creating a much closer, almost dead even situation now in terms of the Senate and the House than perhaps if we had a true national referendum, we might get. But even that trend of the Democrats could be not permanent, and could swing back. So I think there's no way of knowing other than generally, in these situations that there are generally there are going to be outcomes and consequences that nobody can anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes, when I'm talking about this, people think that, well, the Democratic candidate has won the popular vote so consistently recently, they will continue to do that. And this is just, a Democratic ploy to try and win future elections. But that ignores the reality that no one's campaigning to win the national popular vote now, right? And all these ways that we've talked about how campaigns will change will greatly affect how campaigning happens and who turns out to vote.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be kind of a liberating, nice thing to simply say, campaign, you get the most votes, that person becomes our president? That's how it's done. And I'm sorry here, in this case, I'm going to be critical of my own country because I don't think our system has stood up well. Certainly not, whether it did earlier when the whole argument was, well, it magnifies a close election between Kennedy and Nixon, or Carter and Ford, or Nixon and Humphrey in '68, becomes a much bigger election. And that's a good thing because of the Electoral College. Well, whether that was true or not, we've obviously seen, 20 years now of really much more problematic outcomes that have to do with the Electoral College. And, I think the rest of the world generally is smarter about this right now in terms of, then there are parliamentary systems and there are autocratic areas. And I'm not going to get into all the whys and wherefores about democracy, which is certainly under threat right now in the entire world. But to simply have the leading democracy in this country have an election where the person with the most votes wins would seem to me to be a breath of fresh air.
I wholeheartedly agree. I have a few questions here that are just a little bit about the National Popular Vote Bill, so that I'm going to go ahead and tackle. So the question is, who writes the National Popular Vote Bill and submits it to the state, and how does it get on the floor? So the National Popular Vote Bill is exactly the same in every state that it is passed in. The reason for that is because this is how states enter into an agreement with each other. So like you and I, if we were to buy a house, I would sign the same contract as you would as the buyer and the seller. And so the National Popular Vote Bill is the same in every state it's passed in. It's on our website. So any legislator that wanted to submit it could just go right there, and it's 888 words. It's pretty simple and easy to read. And so state legislators submit this bill. We had over 20 states that had this pending earlier this year. Now, some of those sessions have, of course, ended. But it gets on the floor by the political process of, we get a committee hearing and we have enough votes to get it through, and we have support within those state legislatures to get the votes passed. And that is a big part of what National Popular Vote does. That's the bulk of our work, is that lobbying work to meet with legislators and do the education of them and of the public to earn those votes. So if that's something that you want to support, you can always consider making a donation to National Popular Vote, since we are a nonprofit and that is our sole focus, is getting this bill passed. One other technical question that I got about the bill, kind of just what are our chances of getting this bill passed? So we already have 195 electoral votes. So we're over 70% of the way there towards getting this done. This is going to happen this decade, right? We're going to make this happen with enough support from people like yourselves around the country. So we need 75 more electoral votes. Sometimes people say, great, pass Florida and Texas and you'll almost be there. But we've got to pass it in more states than that, because we need the right combination of 5 to 8 states to pass it in the coming years. And so if you want to get involved in that, definitely encourage everyone to write your state legislator. If you go to nationalpopularvote.com/write, WRITE, you can put in your zip code and you can send an email to your senator, your state rep, and your governor all at the same time, letting them know that this is a bill that you support and that you want to see them pass it. If you want to get further involved, you can go to nationalpopularvote.com/volunteer to sign up to get linked in with other people in your state that are working on this so that you can know when a bill is being introduced, or to help plan and attend a lobby day, or show up at your legislators' town hall saying, hey, this is a really important issue to me. Do you agree? Do you have an opinion on this? So there's a lot of resources that our organization provides. If you want to get linked in with that, please go to our website, because we are going to make this happen with all of your help, because the legislators need to hear from us, sure, for educational purposes, but really they need to hear from all of their constituents. That's far more important, that they hear from the people that put them in office that this is something that they want. So with that, I'm going to take let's see, one or two more of these questions that I've gotten here. Here is one that, Paul, I will give to you, and if you want to kick it back to me, I can also answer this. Wouldn't having a national popular vote be difficult to conduct a national recount if it were really close?
I think that the truth is there are enough, every state has a mechanism already in place for doing a recount. We've seen them. And again, I don't want to get into the specific details of what's been happening since November. That's a separate discussion. And I don't want to try to go too far down that road. Under at least the system that was in place prior to these latest legislative sessions in certain states, every single state has a process to recount their votes. It would simply be pretty simple. I'm sure a simple act of Congress could basically say that under this system, if the election was this close, and that's how they're done, by the way, they're all done based on a percentage basis. Some states are different than others, but essentially, if the election's really close, then there is a recount. Sometimes the losing candidate or the candidate who's behind has to pay for it. But the bottom line is there's a mechanism if the election is closer than a point or half a point to set up a recount in those states. I certainly think there's a way that Congress could pass a law that basically says, okay, if the election is this close, all 50 states go ahead with a recount. And, I think that the chances of that recount ever overturning the election would be unbelievably remote. But we can do it. There's no difficulty in actually producing it.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. I mean, it's not impossible to count the votes in the first place. Georgia did a hand recount of 5 million ballots in time for the Electoral College deadline this year. And I love that you are saying that it would be a simple act of Congress to just create a federal recount bill. National Popular Vote agrees. We actually have model legislation for that in our book of what that could potentially look like, because we think that after the National Popular Vote bill is in place would be the perfect time for Congress to consider if that is the right next step, because they'll know, hey, it's 2024 election. It's going to be the first time we're doing it with the National Popular Vote. Let's make sure everyone has the same recount laws. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. With that, I think we've covered most of these questions, and I'm just going to wrap us up here. And I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone. There's, probably I think over 200 people watching live right now. So I'm getting questions from Facebook and from Zoom. So thank you so much to everyone that's joined. If you are ending this webinar thinking, okay, great, I want that. I want my vote to matter in my next presidential election. I want there to be a national popular vote. I really hope that you'll join us in our fight for this reform. As I mentioned at the beginning, National Popular Vote has started this movement back in 2005. And since then, we've passed 15 states in DC, but we still have a lot of work ahead of us to make this happen. We absolutely want this to be the way that we elect the president in 2024. If we don't get it by 2024, that's going to be the last election. We've got to have this happen by the end of the decade. So take action, write your state legislators, get involved on this issue. It's not something that you have to try and argue and fight with your Congress member over, right? These are your state legislators. They should be more accessible. They're people in your state capitals that you can talk to and engage with. So I really hope that you'll write them, nationalpopularvote.com/write, or you'll sign up to volunteer if you want to get further involved so that we can make this happen. Because I don't know about all of you, but I think Paul made a pretty compelling case about how the campaign would look under a national popular vote, and it sounds pretty good to me. Every vote being equal is a simple concept, and it's time that we have this for our presidential elections. So Paul, I really, really appreciate your time and your expertise. This was excellent, and I just really thank you for all of your good work.
Thanks for having me, Eileen. Happy to help out.
All right, thanks. Take care, and I will talk to you all later. Bye, Paul.